It's been brought to my attention that good mornings are not a good glute exercise because some fitness TikTokers with little training experience and a regurgitated surface level understanding of biomechanics said otherwise. So in this video, I'll address some of these fraudulent claims and unequivocally prove why good mornings are a legendary cake exploder. First, let's discuss proximity to failure. It's been stated that due to the barbell being placed on the upper back and neck area, that when performing the hinging pattern, the spinal rectors should fail first since they have worse leverage compared to the glutes, meaning the bigger, stronger glutes receive less stimulus since they might have more reps in the tank. Now, while it is true that the torso is longer, so the weight is further away from the midfoot, which typically results in about 150 pounds less weight being lifted, that's just simple moment arms and applies to all the primary movers, which you would have learned in a basic book like Starting Strength. It does not mean the glutes are being worked less. It's not about absolute load. It's about load magnification. So what can potentially change is proximity to failure depending on technique or slight muscle biasing regarding some muscles, but it doesn't mean the lack of big numbers is challenging the overall spread significantly less. Similar to a close versus wide grip bench press. Here, the triceps are biased to which you might lift 20 to 30 pounds less and be more of a limiting factor failure-wise, but it doesn't change the fact that the chest will always be the primary mover because that's what the movement pattern dictates. So will shoulders adequately grow, to which many never isolate their front delts, even if that's not what typically fails the set. This proves that 100% of the time, even if triceps do fatigue sooner, the proximity to failure for the pecs remains high and is more than enough to create a potent stimulus. Likewise, when examining the good morning, if it is true that spinal rectors fail first, which is purely theoretical by the way and may not apply to seasoned lifters, that does not mean the glutes are far away from failing because they are always the most important muscle that control hip extension, along the adductor magnus and hamstrings. And even if you lift less, it doesn't mean the glutes are physiologically being loaded less as it pertains to percentage of the load, which should make sense to anyone who looked at the squat hinge continuum. Notice how good mornings and RDLs are in the same category and have specific movement patterns to each other. Based on this fact alone, I already reject the initial argument. But in a failure context, just for fun, let's assume the worst and claim that you maybe have 1 rep in reserve for spinal rectors, but 3 for your glutes. Guess what? According to exercise science, this falls within optimal hypertrophy training guidelines. It has been proven that you can sufficiently stimulate a muscle without hitting 100% momentary muscular failure. Doing so creates more fatigue and thus requires less sets, but for most people who perform multiple sets, which is precisely what we see in hypertrophy enthusiasts doing hip hinges, aka moderate to higher volumes, the stimulus on a set per set basis is rather comparable. Meaning, if you did 3 sets of 10 at RPE 8, the glutes would absolutely undergo enough mechanical tension to grow. It's literally irrelevant if they don't technically fail first. And to top things off, almost no one goes to failure on deadlifts anyway. So why the fuck is this even an argument to begin with? In fact, I've been doing good mornings for a good 3 years now, and not once have I taken a set to failure. Yet, I took my numbers from an empty bar all the way to 2.5 plates for reps. So neither my back or legs have failed a single time, yet all the muscles involved grew rather evenly. And this is true for most lifters, by the way, even when discussing RDLs or conventional deadlifts. Therefore, it was never even necessary for the glutes to fail in the first place. And it's probably better not to, for the sake of injury prevention. Now, for those who say, well, proportionally, it could still be the spinal rectors which strengthened and grew the most, I must reply by asking, what delusional planet do you live on where the act of isometric strengthening of the spinal rectors must be so overly biased that adding over 100 pounds to the good morning couldn't be a ton of glutes? Do these people realize how narrow-sighted their ideas appear through honest progressive overload? Especially when we talk about carryover, which proves legit glute gains? Here's what I mean. Take the Romanian deadlift, which all these guys love, and so do I. And in fact, I think it demolishes all dead stop hip hinges, aka dead lifts, for hypertrophy. And general programming for most bodybuilders should prioritize it. In my case, at the start of this year, 405 for 5 reps was rather difficult, and my good morning was around 175. So I decided to forget about RDLs for a bit and only do good mornings for some months. Got them to 225, then 240, then 250, then eventually 275. But before I got to that peak status, I decided to test my RDL to see if there would be any improvement. And you know how many reps I got? 15 repetitions without doing the exercise a single time. I want to know from these so-called experts, how is it possible to triple my strength if the RDL's limiting factor is glutes, which you all universally agree on? How could it be that doing good mornings with about 60% of the RDL weight, aka getting more out of less weight, in which 0 sets were taken at failure, that 1-to-1 carryover could take place? And to top it off, how is it possible that my 565 sumo deadlift went up to 600 pounds despite not doing the exercise a single time? Did spinal erectors allow me to muscle up that much weight? Really? Or is it maybe that good mornings do in fact build the glutes and therefore strengthening them improve my deadlifts and RDLs? You tell me if that makes any sense, because I didn't do any secret RDL training or any deadlift volume for that matter, all of which has been documented. So because we're comparing pure hip hinges, the only logical explanation is that the primary muscles that control hip extension, that's what gets weights moving from point A to B, not isometric contractions, got bigger and stronger, all without going to failure, or at least having to lift heavy number-wise. And it's just not possible that the glutes were somehow bottlenecked, like what you see in a video game, no matter who it is. So I don't want to hear, oh, it's just your anecdote. It can be that an experienced lifter can triple his rep count only by developing the lesser areas. Surely contributing, but the noticeable driver must have been the glutes, considering my rep weights weren't too far off from my squats, and later on in the year, I ended up doing 4.5 plates on the RDL for 9 reps, again without training it. So get this idea of overload out of your head. I too fell for that trap years ago, and what I realized is that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is what matters most, which good mornings yield a great one. Also, easier recovery means more volume. You can do good mornings twice a week for 3 sets of 10 and feel 10 on 10. So we demonstrably have the effective reps for hypertrophy plus ideal volume for glute size. This fact alone should convince any serious lifter to treat good mornings with respect. Even in the case where they're not as optimal, with a reasonable workload that all of you can achieve, this is a non-issue. Next, let's talk about range of motion, because it further proves how weak and disingenuous these criticizers are. Notice how in all their demonstrations, it's with an empty bar or no more than around 95 pounds. Or if there is a plate or more, it is never, and I must emphasize, never equivalent to their body weight or higher. Why is this a major X factor? Because your good morning form changes as you get stronger, due to the laws of gravity. You cannot maintain fully straight legs with optimal balance if the overloaded weight is too far forward. So there will naturally be more knee flexion with the torso being shifted higher. No one who's lifting any respectable weight is going super deep, which lowers the lower back bias. Keep in mind, that was not even necessary to begin with, since your glutes were maximally lengthened way before that. So even the demonstration is false. So in reality, the angles will be almost identical to a Romanian deadlift, where the torso does not reach parallel with the floor. Not to mention, practically identical knee flexion for glute bias. This is why squat mornings are so common, which I do not advise, but it does indicate how form naturally evolves. But those who never got to this stage wouldn't even know. Again, highlighting that their arguments have never been experience-based. Caught red-handed. So basically, you're in your active hinging range and should actually experience a great proximity to failure for the glutes, which is why I alluded to questioning the first criticism to begin with. Even if the premise had some truth, the conclusion was false. And now, with it being more flawed, it further explains why those who do get strong good mornings don't have problems growing their glutes. And why the good morning numbers can eventually be similar to one squat, because the muscles are close enough minus the quad engagement. Getting to that point would not be possible if isometric spinal erector strength was the main contributor, meaning those who are strong at good mornings must, by default, have strong glutes. There's literally no way around this, and that's why Westside Barbell has been so big on good mornings. They're not an influencer clickbaity lift. They're a time-proven, legit muscle and strength developer that heavily work the entire posterior chain. Quite literally capable of building world-class strength. And keep in mind, there's different variations which somehow get left out of this discussion. For example, if you slightly widen your stance, then good mornings are easier on the lower back. And if you use a low bar position, the torso is now shorter, which maintains higher lower back strength throughout the entire range of motion. What about using chains to deload the bottom where there's peak forces on the lower back? This simple hack alone solves everything. So why are these variations not being talked about when there's smart, simple, viable solutions? Why is it always the neck good morning with straight legs, which is least common? Like, I do enjoy that variation, but only as a blending exercise if my posterior chain volume was quite high. It's not the number one staple and won't be done more than once a week. And even regarding the safety squat bar variation, the pad is so thick that it's not as high up on the torso, so you can lift more, similar to the low bar version. So I'd actually recommend that if you have access to it. Only exception is when you reverse the camber, which makes your upper back a limiting factor. But again, that's not the standard way. So why do these influencers only show the hardest possible versions of good mornings that very few of us regularly perform? Because they're trying to create a problem that doesn't exist. Or they're weak and unaware of form tweaks, or are intentionally trying to manipulate you for the sake of showcasing their own special glute exercise. That said, I want to emphasize one last time that even with a high bar good morning or inverted SSB, which is the most lower back, eventually the leverages will change to be more glute biased. This will happen 100% of the time, whether you like it or not. In truth, the only good morning variation that is terrible for glutes is the seated version, because you're not really dynamically lengthening them. The hip position doesn't vary and it's the torso that's moving. Finally, I find it hilarious that many say, oh, the good morning is too lower back dependent, yet fail to recognize how a huge percentage of lifters also have this precise weakness when deadlifting the 500s or beyond. The absolute load becomes so high that even if the glutes are capable of producing maximum force, the spinal erectors can't equally keep up with the demand. So the problem that was first outlined in this video is not exclusive to good mornings. In fact, it could be more of a limiting factor for heavy deadlifts, particularly applying to advanced deadlifters. So you can literally be running into the same problem that's being criticized. How ironic is that? And so, if your spinal erectors are not as strong or as thick as they could be, which is bleeding strength from your poles, what's a good complementary motion to correct them? You guessed it, the good morning, since they're easier to recover from and are very specific. And so, if you make meaningful progress on them for some months, then proceed to deadlift, you will now be able to push your glutes to a higher level of intensity because your lower back won't be failing as soon. Therefore, it could be a good idea to hit variations of good mornings that are even more lower back buys like described earlier. Or in general, just do more good mornings because their inclusion is always helpful. Never forget, you're only strong as your weakest link. And spinal erectors are a very common one. So it's not just about optimal exercise comparisons and isolation. It's the overall programming synergy. That's the secondary important X factor. And through this understanding, it becomes obvious that good mornings are one of the best exercises for glutes in the long term. Whether it's a standalone or accessory to deadlifts, in the grand scheme of programming, you'll be happy you did them. So with that said, I'm done ranting. This was a joke to debunk, and if you want to learn more, please watch this video on RDLs versus good mornings. Also, let me know how they benefit you.